A man died in 1852 after burning his life's work, and the way he died was as strange as anything he ever wrote. Nikolai Gogol spent his final days tied to a bed while doctors covered him with leeches and dumped ice water over his head. 9 days after destroying the manuscript he'd worked on for years, he was gone. This is the story of how a Ukrainian landowner's son became Russia's most influential satirist, then descended into religious mania that consumed him from within. The village of Velikie Sorochintsy in 1809 was the kind of place where reality and folklore blurred together. Ukrainian Cossack traditions mixed with Polish influences, and the Gogol family existed in that strange middle ground between peasant and gentry. Vasily Gogol-Yanovsky owned land, but not much. He wrote poetry and plays in Ukrainian, staging amateur theatricals that the young Nikolai absorbed like oxygen. His mother Maria came from Polish nobility, though her family status had declined. What she lacked in wealth she compensated for, with imagination so vivid it bordered on delusion. Maria called her son Nikola, a hybrid of Russian and Ukrainian that matched everything about his upbringing. The family spoke both languages interchangeably. They weren't quite Russian, weren't quite Ukrainian, weren't quite gentry, weren't quite common. This in-betweenness would define Gogol's entire existence. The household was large and chaotic. Nikolai wasn't the eldest, and the social dynamics taught him early about hierarchies and status anxieties. His father's theatrical productions gave him his first taste of performance. By age 5, he was helping stage plays in his uncle's home theatre, watching adults transform into characters, learning that identity was something you could put on and take off like a costume. Then came 1819. Nikolai's younger brother Ivan, his closest companion, died suddenly during summer vacation. The cause remains unknown. Plague, fever, one of the countless illnesses that killed children in those years. Nikolai was 10 years old, and the death carved something permanent into his psyche. He became obsessed with mortality, convinced that death could strike at any moment, arbitrarily, without reason or warning. This fear never left him. 40 years later, it would drive him to refuse food and medicine, accelerating his own demise. Maria's response to Ivan's death intensified her existing religiosity into something approaching mania. She needed to believe her son's death had meaning. That divine purpose governed everything. Her grip on reality, already loose, weakened further. She began telling elaborate stories about her children's achievements that bore no relationship to fact. After Gogol's death, she would give interviews claiming he'd invented the steam engine and designed Russia's entire railroad network. She wasn't lying exactly. She genuinely believed these things, or convinced herself she did. Truth and fantasy occupied the same space in her mind. Growing up in this environment taught Gogol that reality was negotiable. Facts mattered less than the stories you told about them. This would become the foundation of his literary method, the blending of realistic detail with surreal impossibility that made his work unlike anything written before. In 1820, age 11, Gogol left for the Gymnasium of Higher Sciences in Nedzin. The school was prestigious, or tried to be. It attracted sons of minor gentry, hoping education might elevate their status. Gogol would spend 8 years there, and he hated nearly every minute. His classmates called him the mysterious dwarf. He was short, awkward, with a long, prominent nose that became a source of endless mockery. His physical appearance made him a target, and he responded by becoming secretive, defensive, impossible to know. He formed maybe 2 or 3 genuine friendships during those 8 years. Everyone else he kept at a distance through biting sarcasm and deliberate obscurity. But in the school's theatrical productions, something changed. Put him on stage, give him a character to inhabit, and the awkward boy disappeared. He had an uncanny gift for mimicry, for capturing the mannerisms and speech patterns of others. Playing comic old men and women, he made audiences howl with laughter. The same students who mocked him in class came to rely on his performances for entertainment. This split would define him. In real life, he was isolated, anxious, unable to connect. On stage or on the page, he could be anyone. The The mask was where he felt most himself. His academic performance was mediocre at best. He had no interest in mathematics or science. Languages bored him. What he cared about was observation, studying people, noting how they moved and spoke, and revealed themselves in tiny gestures. He contributed prose and poetry to a school magazine, early experiments that showed promise but little more. What developed during these years was a dark, secretive disposition marked by painful self-consciousness and boundless ambition. He knew he was destined for something, though he couldn't articulate what. The certainty coexisted with crippling insecurity. He was simultaneously convinced of his genius and terrified he was nothing. He also developed a talent that would serve him throughout his career. He could read his own work aloud with such dramatic flair that mediocre passages became riveting. This gift for performance made him consider acting as a profession, though he ultimately decided writing offered a better path to the immortality he craved. In 1828, at age 19, Gogol left Nazin for St. Petersburg with vague but grandiose plans. He was going to become famous. He was going to achieve literary glory. He had no connections, no money beyond a small allowance, and no realistic understanding of how the literary world actually worked. What he did have was a romantic poem he'd written about German pastoral life. The poem was called Hans Kuckelgarten. Gogol published it at his own expense under the pseudonym Full Alof. He waited for the acclaim that would surely follow. Instead, the work was savaged by every critic who bothered to notice it. The reviews were brutal, mocking the poem's sentimentality and amateurish construction. No one had a single positive word. Gogol's response revealed everything about his psychology. He bought up every copy he could find and burned them. All of them. He swore never to write poetry again. Then he seriously considered emigrating to the United States to escape the humiliation. This pattern of dramatic self-destruction in response to criticism would repeat throughout his life, culminating in the final burning that destroyed his masterpiece. He couldn't tolerate failure. He couldn't accept that his vision might be flawed. Better to destroy the evidence than live with the judgment. But he didn't emigrate. He stayed in St. Petersburg and took a job in the civil service, the default career path for educated men without connections or wealth. In 1829, he began working in the Department of State Economy and Public Buildings, a section of the Ministry of Internal Affairs that managed exactly the kind of bureaucratic tedium that crushes souls. The work was mind-numbing, copying documents, filing reports, attending to petty administrative details that served no apparent purpose. The hierarchy was rigid, the atmosphere suffocating. Junior clerks like Gogol were treated as barely human, their individuality erased by the machinery of government. Promotions came through patronage and seniority, not merit. The whole system seemed designed to reward mediocrity and punish initiative. From 1830, he transferred to the Department of Estates, which was somehow even worse. But the experience gave him something invaluable. He was observing Russian bureaucracy from the inside, seeing its absurdities and cruelties firsthand. The petty tyrannies, the status anxieties, the way grown men debased themselves for minor advantages. All of it would feed into his greatest satirical works. During his spare time, he wrote, he contributed pieces to periodicals, small sketches and observations that earned him a few rubles, but no recognition. He was searching for his voice, experimenting with different styles and subjects. Nothing clicked until he turned to childhood memories of Ukraine. He remembered the sunny landscapes, the boisterous village life, the folklore his mother had filled his head with, devils and witches, supernatural beings that lived alongside ordinary peasants. The stories came easily because he wasn't inventing them. He was channeling a world he knew intimately, filtering it through his particular sensibility that saw the fantastic lurking inside the everyday. Around this time, he met the people who would change his trajectory: Vasily Tchaikovsky, the court poet, Pyotr Pletnyov, an influential literary figure, and most importantly, Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest living writer. These men recognized something in the young clerk that others had missed. They saw talent, originality, a voice unlike anything else in Russian literature. Pushkin, in particular, became a kind of mentor. He encouraged Gogol, offered practical advice, and most crucially, believed in him when he barely believed in himself. This relationship would become one of the most important in Gogol's life, though its end would leave him devastated in ways he never fully recovered from. With encouragement from these literary lions, Gogol assembled his Ukrainian stories into a collection. Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka appeared in 2 parts in 1831 and 1832. The title evoked rural simplicity, but the stories themselves were anything but simple. They mixed folklore and realism, comedy and horror, the mundane and the supernatural in ways that Russian literature hadn't seen before. The success was immediate and overwhelming. The young author became famous overnight. Critics praised the collection's originality, its vivid characters, its ability to transport readers to a world both familiar and utterly strange. Readers devoured the stories, delighting in their energy and inventiveness. Gogol had found his voice, and it resonated. Pushkin and Zhukovsky championed the work publicly. Sergei Aksakov, an influential writer, added his praise. The critic Vissarion Belinsky, who would later become one of Russia's most important literary voices, recognized Gogol as a major new talent. Suddenly, the awkward clerk who'd burned his first book in shame was a celebrated author. But celebrity didn't bring happiness. Gogol had achieved the recognition he'd craved, yet he felt empty. The acclaim fed his ambition without satisfying it. He wanted more. He wanted to be more than a writer of Ukrainian folk tales. He wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual, a thinker, a man of importance. This desire led to one of the most embarrassing episodes of his career. He developed an amateur passion for history, particularly medieval history, despite having no formal training or real knowledge. He attempted to secure a position at the University of Kiev, failed, then somehow leveraged his literary fame to win a professorship at St. Petersburg University in 1834. He was made Professor of Medieval History, a job for which he had absolutely no qualifications. The appointment was absurd, the academic equivalent of making a celebrity chef the Surgeon General because they were good with knives. But Gogol accepted, apparently convinced that his genius would translate across disciplines. The disaster unfolded exactly as anyone with sense could have predicted. His lectures were incomprehensible. He mumbled, turned his back to students, spoke in vague generalities that revealed his complete lack of knowledge. When pressed on specific points, he invented excuses to avoid answering. He cancelled classes claiming illness, showed up late, assigned readings he himself hadn't completed. Students were baffled. How had this man become a professor? Some suspected he was conducting an elaborate performance art piece. Others just skipped his lectures entirely. After 1 year of farcical failure, Gogol resigned, though not before the humiliation had scarred him deeply. The experience of being an imposter in academia influenced his later work in subtle ways. His characters often pretend to be something they're not, inhabit roles they haven't earned, navigate social situations through deception and bluff, and Gogol understood fraudulence from the inside because he'd lived it. Despite this setback, his literary career was accelerating. In 1835, he published 2 crucial collections that showed his range expanding beyond Ukrainian folklore. Mirgorod contained 4 stories that continued his pastoral themes, but with darker undertones. Arabesques shifted the setting entirely to St. Petersburg and marked a fundamental transformation in his artistic vision. The St. Petersburg stories were different. Gone were the sunny landscapes and boisterous peasants. In their place came alienation, madness, the crushing weight of urban existence. Nevsky Prospect and Diary of a Madman explored psychological breakdown against the backdrop of fashionable society and bureaucratic inhumanity. These weren't folk tales, they were dissections of modern life's soul-destroying mechanisms. The Nose appeared in 1836, and it remains one of the strangest stories ever written. A nose, that's the protagonist. It detaches from the face of a mid-level bureaucrat named Kovalev and starts living its own life, walking around St. Petersburg dressed in a uniform of higher rank than its former owner. Kovalev wakes up one morning, looks in the mirror, and where his nose should be, there's just flat, smooth skin. Meanwhile, the nose is attending church, visiting shops, conducting itself with an air of superiority that Kovalev himself never possessed. The absurdity is total. When Kovalev finally confronts his nose, it refuses to acknowledge him, claiming not to recognize this noseless man. The nose has a higher social standing now. Why would it return to being mere flesh on someone's face when it could be its own person, respected, saluted by inferiors? Critics have spent nearly 2 centuries trying to explain what the story means. Is it about identity, social climbing, the arbitrary nature of rank in Russian society, castration anxiety, as the Freudians inevitably suggested? Gogol never explained. He just wrote this bizarre tale and let it exist, resisting all attempts to pin it down with meaning. What's clear is that by the mid-1830s, Gogol had developed a completely original artistic vision. He could take the most mundane aspects of bureaucratic life, the obsession with rank, the deference to uniforms, the desperate scramble for status, and push them into surreal territory where the absurdity became visible. His Petersburg wasn't the magnificent capital of empire that official culture celebrated. It was a place where reality itself felt unstable, where a nose could detach and outrank its owner, where madness lurked beneath every interaction. Then came the work that would make him immortal in Russian theatre. The Inspector General premiered in 1836, and it detonated like a bomb in the middle of polite society. The plot is simple. A small provincial town learns that a government inspector is coming incognito to investigate corruption. Panic ensues. Every official is guilty of something. Bribery, embezzlement, incompetence, you name it. Into this atmosphere of terror arrives Klestakov, a minor clerk from St. Petersburg who's travelling through and happens to be broke. The officials mistake him for the inspector. Klestakov, initially confused, realizes what's happening and plays along. He accepts bribes, flirts with the mayor's wife and daughter, and spins increasingly ridiculous lies about his importance in the capital. The officials believe everything. They're so terrified of the real inspector, so desperate to appear innocent, that they accept Klestakov's absurd claims without question. He describes dining with ambassadors, being consulted on matters of state, having 35,000 couriers delivering messages to his door. Impossible, obvious lies. They lap it up. Klestakov eventually leaves town with his pockets full of their money. The officials celebrate their narrow escape. Then a letter arrives. The real inspector is here. The play ends with everyone frozen on stage in tableau, mouths open, caught in the moment of realizing their catastrophic error. What made the Inspector General so dangerous wasn't just its mockery of corruption. Corruption in provincial Russia wasn't exactly news. What cut deep was how the play revealed the officials' willingness to believe anything that confirmed their own guilt. They convicted themselves. Klestakov didn't need to investigate. He just had to exist, and they confessed everything through their attempts to hide it. The premiere was attended by Tsar Nicholas I himself, who reportedly laughed and said, "Everyone got what was coming to them, and I most of all." The audience took this as permission to laugh too, but Gogol didn't experience the premiere as a triumph. He sat in the theatre watching people laugh, and he became convinced they were laughing wrong. They were enjoying the farce, the comedy of mistaken identity, the ridiculous situations. They were missing his deeper moral purpose. This conviction that audiences misunderstood him would haunt Gogol for the rest of his life. He'd intended the play as a mirror, showing Russia its own corruption, a moral lesson wrapped in comedy. Instead, people just thought it was funny. The disconnect between his intention and reception tormented him. Conservative officials were less amused than the Tsar. They saw the play as an attack on Russian institutions, a betrayal by someone who should have been celebrating the empire, not mocking it. Liberal intellectuals loved it for exactly that reason. Gogol found himself claimed by political camps he didn't belong to, praised for reasons he didn't recognize, attacked for satire he hadn't intended as political. His response was to flee. In June 1836, barely 2 months after the premiere, he left Russia. He wouldn't return for any extended period for 12 years. The first stops were Germany and Switzerland, but Italy became his true home in exile, Rome specifically. He arrived in 1837 and fell completely in love with the city, the light, the art, the sense of living among centuries of human achievement. For a man who'd grown up in provincial Ukraine and spent his adult years in the grey, bureaucratic maze of St. Petersburg, Rome felt like a revelation. He studied Italian art, attended operas, walked the ancient streets. He read Dante, immersed himself in Italian literature. The distance from Russia gave him perspective and freedom. No one in Rome cared about Russian literary politics or provincial corruption. He could work without the pressure of immediate response. But Rome couldn't protect him from the news that arrived in early 1837. Pushkin was dead, killed in a duel at age 37, shot defending his wife's honor against a French officer who may or may not have been having an affair with her. The news devastated Gogol. Pushkin had been more than a literary supporter. He'd been a stabilizing presence, someone whose judgment Gogol trusted, whose encouragement meant everything. Pushkin had suggested the plots for both the Inspector General and the work Gogol was now beginning, Dead Souls. He'd read drafts, offered advice, believed in Gogol's genius when Gogol himself doubted it. Now he was gone, senselessly, stupidly, in a duel over marital honor and social reputation. The randomness of it, the waste, reinforced every anxiety Gogol had about death's capriciousness. If Pushkin could be killed at 37, anyone could die at any moment. Gogol threw himself into work as a way of managing grief. Dead Souls became his obsession, the project that would justify his existence and honor Pushkin's memory. The novel's premise came from Pushkin himself. A con man travels through rural Russia, buying the legal titles to dead serfs who still appear on tax rolls. Landowners are happy to sell these dead souls cheaply, since they're paying taxes on them anyway. The con man then uses the accumulated titles as collateral for loans, essentially creating wealth from nothing. It's a perfect Gogolian setup. The dead treated as living for bureaucratic purposes, paper reality overriding actual reality, a system so absurd it enables its own exploitation. But Gogol's ambitions went far beyond satirizing serfdom. He envisioned Dead Souls as an epic in 3 parts, a Russian divine comedy. Part 1 would be the Inferno, showing Russia's moral degradation through the journey of the conman Chichikov. Part 2 would be Purgatory, showing Chichikov's moral struggle and the possibility of redemption. Part 3 would be Paradise, revealing Russia's spiritual potential and path to salvation. This wasn't just a novel. This was going to be a holy mission. Literature as moral transformation, art as the vehicle for Russia's spiritual rebirth. Gogol was taking on responsibilities that might have crushed someone more psychologically stable. He certainly wasn't equipped for them. The writing went slowly. He worked in Rome, then travelled to Paris, back to Rome, to Vienna. The manuscript accompanied him everywhere. He revised obsessively, rewrote entire sections, agonized over every sentence. By 1841, he had a complete draft of Part 1. He returned to Russia briefly to oversee its publication, then fled back to Rome almost immediately. Dead Souls appeared in 1842 and was recognized immediately as a masterpiece. Critics compared it to Dante, to Cervantes, to the greatest works of European literature. The reading public devoured it. Everyone saw themselves reflected in Gogol's gallery of grotesques, the landowner's Chichikov visits on his journey, each representing a different form of spiritual death. There's Manilov, who lives in clouds of sentimental fantasy, accomplishing nothing while congratulating himself on his refined sensibility. Korobochka, the obsessive hoarder who can't see beyond immediate material accumulation. Nozdryov, the compulsive liar and gambler. Sobakovich, the brutal materialist who sees everything in terms of weight and price. Plyushkin, the miser who's descended into complete squalor despite owning vast estates, hoarding worthless trash while his serfs starve. These weren't just characters. They were psychological types, moral categories, warnings about what happens when souls die while bodies continue functioning. Gogol's genius was making them simultaneously grotesque and recognizable. Readers knew people like this. Hell, readers were people like this. Chichikov himself remains mysterious throughout. We learn his background in the final chapters, his rise and fall through various schemes, but we never fully understand what drives him. He's not evil exactly. He's empty. He exists to accumulate, to scheme, to climb, without any sense of why beyond the climbing itself. A dead soul buying dead souls. The novel's structure is loose, episodic, digressive. Gogol interrupts the narrative constantly with philosophical asides, lyrical passages about Russia's landscape and destiny, bitter commentary on human nature. Critics who wanted a neat plot found it frustrating, but the digressions were the point. Gogol was doing something new, creating a prose form that could contain both realistic satire and metaphysical speculation, both sharp social observation and mystical yearning. The success should have satisfied him. Should have. But Gogol's relationship with success had always been complicated. Achievement brought no peace, only pressure to achieve more. And now he'd set himself an impossible task, writing parts 2 and 3, showing not just Russia's degradation, but its redemption. How do you write redemption when your genius is for depicting degradation? How do you create virtuous characters when your talent is for exposing vice? Gogol spent the next decade trying to answer these questions, and the attempt nearly destroyed him. But before the destruction came a final masterpiece, published in 1842 alongside Dead Souls. A short story that Dostoevsky would later claim was the source of all Russian realism. The Overcoat tells the story of Akaky Akakievich Bashmachkin, the most insignificant man imaginable. He's a copying clerk, the lowest rank in the bureaucratic hierarchy. His job is to copy documents by hand, nothing more. He's been doing this for years, will do it until he dies. He's not stupid, not lazy. He's just accepted his place with complete resignation. He lives in a tiny room, eats basic food, has no friends, no family, no desires beyond his work. Then winter comes, and Akaky realizes his overcoat is beyond repair. The cold Petersburg wind cuts through the thin fabric. He needs a new coat. But a new coat costs money he doesn't have. So he begins saving, cutting his expenses to the bone, working extra hours for additional kopecks, sacrificing everything to accumulate the necessary funds. The coat becomes his obsession, his dream, his entire existence. When he finally has enough money saved, he visits the tailor, orders the coat, and waits in an agony of anticipation. The day it's ready, he picks it up, wears it to work, and experiences a moment of pure joy. People notice him. Colleagues who've ignored him for years suddenly see him. He's invited to a party. For one evening, Akaky Akakievich matters. Walking home that night, drunk on this unprecedented social recognition, he's mugged. The coat is stolen. He reports the theft to the police, who couldn't care less. He tries to get an audience with an important general who might help, but the general, annoyed at being bothered by such an insignificant person, yells at him so harshly that Akaki stumbles out into the cold street in shock. He catches fever. Within days, he's dead. The department notices his absence. Someone new is hired to do his copying, and that's that. Akaki Akakievich existed, suffered, and disappeared without leaving a trace. Except that's not quite the end. The story concludes with a supernatural coda. A ghost starts appearing near the bridge where Akaki was robbed, stealing coats from passers-by. The ghost eventually steals the coat from the general who humiliated him. After that, it's never seen again. The Overcoat distills everything Gogol understood about how bureaucracy crushes individual humanity. Akaki isn't a hero. He has no grand ambitions or revolutionary thoughts. He's just a man who wants a warm coat, a tiny scrap of dignity in a world designed to deny him even that. The system was the villain, and Gogol knew it better than anyone because he'd been inside it, copying documents like Akaki, watching men sacrifice their humanity for a fraction of advancement. But understanding the system and escaping it are different things. By 1842, Gogol was famous. Dead Souls had cemented his reputation as Russia's greatest living writer. The Overcoat was being quoted in salons across Petersburg. Critics called him a genius. Readers devoured everything he published. He'd achieved what he'd dreamed of since burning Hans Kuchelgarten in humiliation 14 years earlier. None of it made him happy. Success brought expectations. Publishers wanted more stories. Readers wanted another novel. The literary establishment wanted him at their gatherings, their debates, their endless social performances. Gogol hated all of it. The attention made him uncomfortable. The praise felt hollow. And beneath everything was a growing conviction that his work, for all its acclaim, had failed to accomplish what truly mattered. He'd satirized Russian society brilliantly. Everyone agreed on that. His portraits of corruption, stupidity, and moral emptiness were devastatingly accurate. But satire exposed problems without solving them. It made people laugh at the absurdity of their world, then sent them back into that same world unchanged. What good was mockery if nothing improved? This question began eating at Gogol. He'd spent years perfecting the art of showing Russians how ridiculous their society was. Now he wondered if he'd wasted his talent on something ultimately pointless. The laughter he'd generated felt increasingly like a form of complicity, a way of acknowledging problems while avoiding the harder work of fixing them. The religious crisis that had been simmering since his near-death illness in 1840 intensified. Gogol became convinced that literature had moral responsibilities beyond entertainment or even social criticism. A writer, especially one with his gifts and influence, should guide readers toward truth, toward goodness, toward salvation. But how? His genius was for satire, for capturing the grotesque and absurd. When he tried to write positive characters, virtuous people, living righteous lives, the results were wooden and unconvincing. The rogues in Dead Souls practically leapt off the page with their vivid awfulness. The few attempts at depicting goodness felt like cardboard cutouts mouthing platitudes. This created an impossible dilemma. His talent worked in one direction, exposing vice and folly. His conscience demanded he work in the opposite direction, illuminating virtue and truth. Every attempt to reconcile these opposing forces left him frustrated and doubting his worth as both an artist and a moral being. The solution, he decided, was to complete Dead Souls as originally conceived. Remember, he'd always planned it as a 3-part work modelled on Dante's Divine Comedy. Part 1, already published, was the Inferno, showing the hell of Russian spiritual corruption through Chichikov's scheme to buy dead serfs. Part 2 would be Purgatorio, showing characters beginning their moral redemption. Part 3 would be Paradiso, presenting a vision of Russia transformed and purified. It was an audacious plan, perhaps too audacious, Dante had the advantage of working within established Christian cosmology. Heaven, hell, and purgatory were clearly defined territories with known rules. Gogol was trying to map spiritual geography onto contemporary Russian society to show not just punishment and reward in the afterlife, but transformation in this life. The work consumed him. He retreated from Petersburg society, spending most of his time abroad, primarily in Rome. Italy became his refuge, a place where he could escape Russian winters, Russian bureaucracy, Russian expectations. Rome especially captivated him, with its layers of history, its artistic treasures, its different quality of light. But even in Rome, he couldn't escape himself. Letters from this period reveal a man struggling with every sentence. Writing had once flowed naturally. Now each word was extracted with painful effort. He'd draft chapters, read them over, recognise they weren't working, and start again. The satirical sections still came easily, but those were Part 1 territory, the hell he'd already mapped. Part 2 required something different, something he couldn't quite access. Friends who visited him in Rome reported his state of mind with growing concern. He was obsessive about his health, constantly convinced he was dying from some mysterious ailment. He followed bizarre dietary regimens, spent hours in prayer, and spoke increasingly about his unworthiness and the sinfulness of his earlier works. The man who'd written The Inspector General was now suggesting that comedy itself might be immoral. In 1845, something snapped. Gogol burned the manuscript of Part 2. 4 years of work, hundreds of pages, reduced to ash in his fireplace. The act was deliberate, not accidental. He invited a friend to witness it, wanted someone to see what he was doing and understand that it was a choice, not a moment of madness. Why? His explanation was that the work wasn't good enough, that it failed to achieve what he'd set out to do. The characters, meant to show moral improvement, came across as preachy and false. The Russia he was trying to imagine, one moving towards spiritual health, felt like wishful thinking disconnected from reality. But there was more to it than artistic dissatisfaction. Burning the manuscript was an act of self-punishment, a purification ritual. If his earlier satirical works had contributed to Russia's moral confusion by making people laugh at vice without showing them virtue, then this failed attempt to correct that error only compounded his guilt. The pattern established with Hans Kuchelgarten was repeating at a grander scale. Faced with failure, real or perceived, Gogol's response was destruction. After burning the manuscript, he collapsed. Friends found him semi-conscious, talking about dying, convinced that God was punishing him. It took weeks for him to recover physically, though mentally he never quite did. Yet, he couldn't abandon the project. Dead Souls. Part 2 became his white whale, the thing he had to complete to justify his existence, but couldn't complete no matter how hard he tried. He started over, writing new versions, attempting different approaches, always hitting the same wall. How do you portray goodness convincingly when your talent is for exposing evil? Some writers could manage both. Dickens created memorable villains and equally memorable saints. Tolstoy would later show characters achieving genuine moral growth without losing their complexity. But Gogol couldn't. His psychology, his artistic instincts, his entire creative mechanism was calibrated for one thing. The more he struggled with this limitation, the more he questioned whether literature itself was a valid path to spiritual truth. Maybe fiction was inherently deceptive, a form of lying even when it claimed to reveal truth. Maybe only direct moral instruction, religious teaching, plain statements of what was right and wrong could actually improve people. This thinking led to selected passages from correspondence with friends, published in 1847. The book was a catastrophe. Gogol presented it as his most important work, the culmination of everything he'd learned about Russia's problems and their solutions. It consisted of letters, essays, and meditations offering advice on how Russians should live, how society should be organized, how spiritual salvation could be achieved. The content was shocking. The man who'd satirized autocracy and serfdom now defended both as ordained by God. The writer who'd exposed bureaucratic corruption now insisted that subjects should obey their rulers without question. He praised the Orthodox Church's most conservative elements, condemned Western European influence, and argued that Russia's path forward lay in returning to traditional hierarchies and religious obedience. His former admirers were horrified. Vissarion Belinsky, the influential critic who championed Gogol's earlier works, wrote a devastating open letter. He accused Gogol of betraying everything his art had stood for, of abandoning the cause of progress for reactionary mysticism. The letter circulated widely in manuscript, becoming one of the most important documents in Russian intellectual history. Belinsky's rage was personal. He'd believed Gogol's satires were weapons against tyranny and ignorance. Now the satirist was defending the very things he'd mocked. It felt like betrayal, like Gogol had been lying all along about what he stood for. But Gogol hadn't been lying. He'd been confused, and he'd grown more confused over time. The young writer who'd exposed Russian society's absurdities had genuinely believed that exposure would lead to improvement. When it didn't, when the laughter changed nothing, he'd lost faith in his own method and grasped for something else. Selected Passages was his attempt to become what he thought Russia needed, a moral teacher rather than a satirist. The problem was that he had no talent for it. The passages that worked in the book were the ones where his natural instincts broke through the moralizing, where he forgot to preach and just observed human behaviour with his characteristic sharpness. The rest was tedious, contradictory, sometimes incoherent. It read like the work of someone trying to convince himself of positions he didn't naturally hold. The book's failure devastated Gogol worse than any previous setback. This wasn't a youthful attempt like Hans Kuchelgarten that he could dismiss as immaturity. This was his mature statement, his attempt to redirect his career toward moral purpose, and everyone hated it. Even people who agreed with its conservative politics found it poorly executed. Even readers sympathetic to religious themes found it overwrought and confused. And the liberal intelligentsia, his natural audience, saw it as proof that Gogol had gone mad or sold out or both. He retreated deeper into himself, into prayer and fasting, into consultations with spiritual advisors who reinforced his worst impulses. The conviction grew that his literary success had been a trap, that Satan had given him talent specifically to lead him and his readers astray. If the Inspector General made people laugh at corruption without inspiring them to fight it, wasn't that the devil's work? If Dead Souls showed the emptiness of Russian life without offering a path toward fullness, wasn't that spiritual poison disguised as art? These questions tortured him. They also paralyzed him. He kept working on Part 2 of Dead Souls, kept trying to create the moral counterweight to Part 1's satire, kept failing. The surviving fragments show characters who are meant to be good but come across as stiff and unconvincing. There's a landowner who runs his estate justly, a governor who administers wisely, a merchant who conducts business honestly. On paper, these should be admirable figures. In Gogol's prose, they're lifeless. Compare them to Chichikov, to Sobakovich, to any of the grotesques from Part 1. Those characters live. They breathe and sweat and scheme. You can see them, hear them, smell them. The virtuous characters in Part 2 are concepts, not people. Gogol knew it. Every time he reread what he'd written, he knew it wasn't working. The knowledge drove him deeper into despair and self-recrimination. By the late 1840s, his mental state was clearly deteriorating. Friends reported bizarre behaviours, obsessive religious practices, periods of deep depression, alternating with manic energy. His health complaints multiplied. He was convinced he had some terrible disease that doctors couldn't diagnose, that his body was failing in mysterious ways. Modern readers might recognize symptoms of severe depression, anxiety, possibly obsessive-compulsive disorder, but 19th century medicine had no such frameworks. Gogol was simply seen as eccentric, neurotic, difficult. The tragedy is that he never lost his artistic vision. Letters and fragments from his final years show the same sharp observations, the same ability to capture character in a few perfect details. When he forgot to be moral and just described what he saw, the genius was still there, but he couldn't forget. The burden of moral purpose crushed his natural gifts. In 1848, he made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, hoping that visiting the Holy Land would provide spiritual clarity. It didn't. The trip exhausted him physically and left him spiritually unchanged. Jerusalem was hot, dusty, crowded with tourists and merchants. The sacred sites felt commercialized. He'd hoped for revelation and got disappointment. Returning to Russia, he settled in Moscow and devoted himself entirely to completing part 2 of Dead Souls. It had to be finished. It had to work. His salvation, Russia's salvation, depended on it. Then he met Father Matvey Konstantinovsky. Father Konstantinovsky wasn't just a spiritual advisor. He was a fundamentalist who saw the modern world as Satan's playground and literature as one of its most dangerous toys. To him, Gogol's fame was evidence of corruption, not achievement. The fact that thousands of people had read and loved his works proved they were spiritually poisonous. If they'd been truly holy, the masses would have rejected them. This logic appealed to something broken in Gogol. He'd always felt unworthy of his success, always suspected that his talent came from a dark source. Konstantinovsky confirmed these fears and gave them theological weight. "Your writing isn't just bad for you," the priest explained. "It's bad for Russia. It's bad for souls. Every person who laughs at your satire, instead of weeping for their sins, moves further from God." The priest prescribed a spiritual regimen that would destroy what remained of Gogol's creative life. Constant prayer, severe fasting, renunciation of worldly things, especially artistic pride, reading only religious texts, and most important, abandoning the sinful project of Dead Souls Part 2. Gogol tried to resist. He explained that Part 2 was meant to show the path to redemption, that it would balance the darkness of Part 1 with light. Konstantinovsky wasn't convinced. The very attempt to create moral examples through fiction was prideful. Who was Gogol to presume he could teach virtue? Only God could transform hearts. Literature was just human vanity dressed in pretty words. Other friends tried to intervene. They could see what was happening, could see Konstantinovsky's influence driving Gogol toward collapse. But by this point, Gogol trusted the priest more than anyone else. His closest friends from earlier years had drifted away or been pushed away. The people who remained were either enablers of his religious mania or too intimidated to challenge it. Count Alexander Tolstoy, a distant relative of the more famous Leo, tried reasoning with him. Gogol had known the Count for years, had stayed at his estate, had trusted his judgment. But when Tolstoy urged him to eat properly, to rest, to stop punishing himself, Gogol heard Satan's voice using a friend's mouth. The work on Part 2 became torture. Every morning he'd sit at his desk with the manuscript pages in front of him. He'd read what he'd written, find it inadequate, and spiral into despair. Then he'd pray for hours, begging God to guide his pen. Then he'd try writing again, produce a few stilted paragraphs, recognize their lifelessness, and conclude that God was withholding inspiration because Gogol remained unworthy. The fragments that survive from this final version show glimpses of the old genius fighting to break through. There's a scene with a landowner named Kostanzhoglo who runs his estate efficiently and treats his serfs well. When Gogol forgets his moral agenda and just describes how the estate functions, the writing comes alive. You can see the crops growing, smell the livestock, hear the peasants working. But then he remembers he's supposed to be teaching a lesson, and everything goes wooden. Constantinople delivers a speech about proper management that reads like an economics textbook. He explains crop rotation, animal husbandry, accounting practices. It's informative, but deadly dull. Compare this to any speech by a character in Part 1. When Sobakovich talks about his possessions, you feel his crude materialism in every word. When Nozdryov lies about his adventures, you hear the desperation beneath the bravado. The Part 2 characters don't have that dimensionality. They're types, not people. Gogol knew it. His letters from this period are heartbreaking. He writes to friends explaining that he's working constantly, but producing nothing of value. The words won't come, or they come but they're wrong. He's lost his gift, or God has taken it away, and he doesn't know how to get it back. Meanwhile, his health deteriorated. The fasting that Konstantinovsky prescribed became more extreme. Gogol would go days eating almost nothing, then break the fast with a small piece of bread or a few spoonfuls of soup. His body began shutting down. Friends who saw him were shocked by his appearance. He'd always been thin, but now he was skeletal. His eyes were sunken, his skin grey. The physical decline fed the spiritual crisis. Gogol interpreted his weakness as God's judgment. If he were truly righteous, he'd be strong despite the fasting. Holy men in the desert had survived on nothing. His inability to do the same proved his unworthiness. He also suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as severe depression. The symptoms are clear in contemporary accounts. Loss of appetite beyond even the religious fasting, inability to feel pleasure or interest in anything, constant fatigue, overwhelming guilt and self-loathing, sleep disturbances, the conviction that he was a burden to everyone around him and that the world would be better without him. But 19th century Russia had no concept of clinical depression. What Gogol experienced was interpreted through religious and moral frameworks. He wasn't sick. He was struggling with demons, both metaphorical and possibly literal. The treatment wasn't medical, but spiritual. More prayer, more fasting, more renunciation. The tragic irony is that Gogol's earlier work had shown remarkable psychological insight. The narrator of Diary of a Madman descends into psychosis in ways that feel disturbingly real. Gogol understood mental breakdown from the inside. But he couldn't apply that understanding to himself. When his own mind began failing, he saw it as spiritual failure rather than illness. Early 1852 brought the final crisis. Gogol had been living in Moscow, staying with Count Tolstoy. He'd brought the manuscript of Dead Souls Part 2 with him, still working on it, still failing to make it work. Father Konstantinovsky visited regularly, continuing to push Gogol toward complete renunciation of literary activity. The exact sequence of events in late February is disputed. Different witnesses gave different accounts, but the essential story is this. Gogol had another crisis of faith about his work. He reread the manuscript and found it not just inadequate, but actively harmful. The attempt to depict virtue through fiction was itself prideful and therefore sinful. Konstantinovsky had been right all along. On the night of February 24th, 1852, Gogol called his servant and asked for the manuscript portfolio. He took it to the fireplace in his room. Then he burned everything. The entire manuscript of Dead Souls Part 2, years of work, went into the flames. Some accounts say he wept while doing it. Others say he was calm, even relieved. One version has him initially burning the wrong portfolio and having to correct the mistake. We'll never know exactly what happened because the only witness was a servant who gave conflicting stories over the years. What we do know is that by morning, the manuscript was ash and Gogol had crossed a line from which there was no return. The destruction of his work, the second time he'd burned a major manuscript, triggered a complete breakdown. He took to his bed and refused to eat anything at all. Friends gathered, alarmed by his condition. They begged him to eat, to drink water, to see doctors. He refused everything. When they brought food to his room, he turned his face to the wall. When they tried to force him, he became agitated. He needed to fast. He needed to prepare himself. Death was coming, and he had to be ready. The doctors who were finally called had no idea what to do with a patient who refused treatment. They diagnosed him with various ailments, none accurate. The treatments they prescribed were worse than useless. They bled him, applied leeches, subjected him to hot baths followed by ice water dousing, all standard medical practice of the era, and all completely wrong for someone dying of starvation and psychological collapse. Gogol endured these tortures with minimal resistance. Perhaps he saw them as deserved punishment. Perhaps he was too weak to fight. Eyewitness accounts describe a man barely conscious, mumbling prayers, occasionally calling out names from his past. His mother, his dead brother, Ivan, Pushkin. Count Tolstoy sat with him through the final days, helpless to prevent what was happening. Other friends came and went, equally powerless. They watched Russia's greatest living writer destroy himself and couldn't stop it. The tragedy wasn't just Gogol's death, but the senselessness of it. He wasn't dying of disease or old age. He was dying of despair, of guilt, of a religious mania that had convinced him his greatest achievements were sins. On March 4th, 1852, just 9 days after burning his manuscript, Nikolai Gogol died. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was listed as inflammation of the brain, which meant nothing. The real causes were starvation, medical malpractice, and spiritual agony. The funeral was enormous. Thousands of people turned out to mourn. The literary establishment eulogized him as Russia's greatest satirist. Students and intellectuals saw him as a champion of progressive thought. The religious establishment praised his final turn toward God. Everyone claimed him, and no one understood him. The surviving fragments of Dead Souls Part 2 were eventually published, reconstructed from earlier drafts that hadn't been burned. Reading them is a strange experience. You can see what Gogol was trying to do, can glimpse moments where the old magic almost returns, and can feel the weight of expectation crushing the life out of the prose. There's a character named Murazov, a wealthy merchant who's also genuinely good. He makes his money honestly, treats his employees fairly, uses his wealth to help others. On paper, he should be inspiring. On the page, he's a cipher. Gogol couldn't make goodness interesting because he'd lost the ability to observe it clearly. He was trying to create an ideal rather than a person, and ideals don't breathe. The irony is savage. Gogol's genius lay in showing human beings as they actually are, flawed and ridiculous, and sometimes terrible, but undeniably alive. When he tried to show them as they should be, everything went dead. The moral purpose he thought would redeem his work actually destroyed it. And the greater irony, the one that would have tortured Gogol if he'd lived to see it, is that his satirical works did more to improve Russian society than any moral treatise could have. The Inspector General made corruption harder to ignore. The Overcoat made readers see the humanity in people they'd previously overlooked. Dead Souls. Part 1 captured something essential about Russian life that no amount of religious instruction could match. The works he thought were sinful were actually his greatest moral achievements. The work he thought would be redemptive was stillborn. This creates an impossible situation. If you're a writer whose entire identity rests on your ability to create, and you become convinced that creating is itself sinful, what's left? Gogol's final years weren't just about religious mania. They were about the collision between two incompatible versions of himself. The artist who'd given Russia some of its greatest literature, and the penitent who believed that very literature had damned his soul. His friends watched this deterioration with growing alarm. They'd seen him struggle before, seen the cycles of depression and renewal. But this was different. The light had gone out entirely. Turgenev visited him in the late 1840s and was shocked by the change. The brilliant conversationalist who'd once entertained salons with readings from his works now spoke only in religious platitudes. The sharp observer of human nature now saw everything through the lens of sin and redemption, and he was writing letters, endless letters to friends and acquaintances, offering spiritual guidance they hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. These letters would become selected passages from correspondence with friends, published in 1847, and they would destroy what remained of his reputation among the progressive intellectuals who championed his work. The book is staggering in its wrong-headedness. Gogol defends serfdom as divinely ordained. He argues that peasants should be grateful for their chains because suffering builds character. He tells landowners to be kind masters, but never questions whether having masters is the problem. He praises the Orthodox Church with the fervour of a convert. Never mind that he'd been Orthodox his entire life. He defends autocracy, argues against reform, and presents himself as a prophet guiding Russia towards spiritual renewal. Belinsky, the critic who'd done more than anyone to build Gogol's reputation, was appalled. He wrote a letter in response that became one of the most famous documents in Russian literary history. You can feel the betrayal in every line. Belinsky had believed in Gogol, had seen him as a force for social progress, had interpreted the Inspector General and Dead Souls as attacks on the system, and now here was Gogol defending that same system, wrapping tyranny in religious justification. The letter couldn't be published in Russia because it was too inflammatory, but it circulated in manuscript form and became a rallying cry for progressive intellectuals. Dostoevsky was arrested for reading it aloud at a gathering. That's how incendiary it was. Gogol's response to this criticism was to double down. He hadn't made himself clear enough. People had misunderstood. He needed to explain better, to write more forcefully, to complete Dead Souls Part 2 and show everyone what he really meant. But the more he tried to write virtue, the more it eluded him. There's something almost mathematically precise about how Gogol's talent worked. He could observe reality with microscopic accuracy and render it with surgical precision. He could capture the exact quality of human weakness, the specific texture of self-deception, the precise anatomy of corruption. What he couldn't do was imagine goodness that felt real. The good characters in Part 2 are abstractions. They say the right things, perform the right actions, but they don't live on the page the way Chichikov or Nozdryov or Sobakovich did. They're moral lessons wearing human skin, and Gogol knew it. He'd write a chapter, reread it, hate it, and start over. The process became torture. Where he'd once written with facility, letting the words flow, he now agonized over every sentence, and always there was Father Konstantinovsky reading his work and finding it wanting. Not good enough, not holy enough, too worldly, too concerned with art when it should be concerned only with salvation. Gogol began a pattern of extreme fasting. Religious fasting was common in Orthodox practice, but Gogol took it to dangerous extremes. He'd eat almost nothing for days, weakening himself, convinced that mortifying the flesh would somehow purify the spirit and allow him to write the masterpiece he'd promised. It didn't work. Starvation doesn't make you a better writer. It makes you weak and confused and unable to think clearly. His friends tried to intervene. Count Tolstoy, who'd supported him for years, begged him to eat, to rest, to stop torturing himself. Others tried to separate him from Father Konstantinovsky's influence, recognizing the priest's fanaticism as dangerous. But Gogol wouldn't listen. He'd found certainty in his religious convictions, and certainty was more appealing than the ambiguity that had tormented him for decades. The problem with certainty is that it requires you to ignore evidence, and the evidence was mounting that something had gone terribly wrong. He was getting weaker. His handwriting, once precise and elegant, became shaky and erratic. He suffered from constant headaches, digestive problems, and insomnia. The fasting was destroying his body, but he interpreted the suffering as holy rather than harmful, and he kept burning manuscripts. The 1845 burning of Dead Souls. Part 2 wasn't the last time. He'd write chapters, decide they were worthless, and destroy them. Then he'd start over, write more, and burn those too. The cycle repeated with increasing frequency. Each burning was a small suicide. He was killing the work, and by extension, killing the part of himself that created it. By early 1852, Gogol had essentially stopped eating entirely. He'd broken through normal fasting into something closer to deliberate starvation. His friends were terrified, but he insisted he was following God's will. Father Konstantinovsky encouraged this. He told Gogol that his suffering was holy, that denying the flesh was the path to salvation, that the world's wisdom was foolishness before God. On the night of February 11th, 1852, Gogol made his final decision. He gathered his manuscripts, the latest version of Dead Souls Part 2, and he burned them. His servant tried to stop him. He begged Gogol to reconsider, to save the work. But Gogol's hands were steady as he fed page after page into the fire. When it was done, he collapsed, sobbing. He told his servant it had been a mistake, that the devil had tricked him. But the manuscripts were ash. There was no undoing it. This is where the story becomes almost unbearably sad. Because for the next 9 days, Gogol wanted to live. The death wish that had driven him to burn his work and starve himself suddenly reversed. He begged his friends to save him, to help him recover. But he'd gone too far. His body was shutting down from malnutrition, and the doctors, following the barbaric medical practices of 1852, made everything worse. They applied leeches to drain his blood. They dunked him in ice water to shock his system. They forced him into scalding baths. They did everything except give him food and rest, the only things that might have saved him. Gogol, weak and terrified, endured these treatments. He cried out for his mother, for his dead brother Ivan, for Pushkin. He prayed and begged and suffered. Count Tolstoy sat with him through those final days. He described a man caught between worlds, sometimes lucid enough to know he was dying, sometimes delirious, always in pain. Russia mourned its greatest satirist. Speeches praised his genius. Critics who'd attacked selected passages now eulogized him as a champion of truth. The government he'd defended in his final years claimed him as a patriot. The progressives he'd disappointed claimed him as one of their own. Everyone wanted a piece of Gogol. Everyone had a theory about what he'd really meant, what he'd really believed, what his work really represented. But Gogol himself was beyond caring. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to figure out what he was supposed to be, what his work was supposed to mean, what God wanted from him, and he'd died without answers. The great irony is that his satirical works, the ones he'd come to see as sinful, did more good than any moral treatise could have. The Inspector General made corruption harder to ignore. The Overcoat made readers see the humanity in people they'd previously dismissed. Dead Souls captured something essential about Russian society that social reform couldn't address, but literature could. The work he thought would redeem him, Part 2 of Dead Souls, died with him. What survives are fragments reconstructed from earlier drafts that escaped the fires. Reading them is like examining archaeological remains, trying to imagine the complete structure from scattered pieces. You can see what he was attempting. Chichikov was supposed to transform, to become a better man through suffering and divine intervention. Other characters were supposed to demonstrate virtue, to show that goodness was possible even in corrupt Russia. But the fragments are lifeless. The energy that animated Part 1 is absent. These aren't real people. They're moral examples, and moral examples don't breathe. Gogol's genius was for showing human beings as they actually are, ridiculous and flawed and sometimes terrible, but undeniably alive. When he tried to show them as they should be, everything went flat. And here's the tragedy he couldn't see. His satirical works were moral achievements precisely because they were truthful. They didn't preach. they showed. They held up a mirror to Russian society and forced people to see themselves clearly. That clarity was uncomfortable. It made people angry. But it also made them think, made them question, made them recognize that maybe things didn't have to be this way. The works he burned, the works he thought would save Russia, couldn't have done that. They would have been forgotten, dismissed as reactionary nonsense from a writer who'd lost his edge. The works that survived, the ones he feared were sinful, are the ones that changed Russian literature forever. Dostoevsky said all Russian realists came from under Gogol's overcoat. He meant that Gogol had shown them how to write about ordinary people with dignity, how to find profound meaning in small lives, how to blend the realistic and the fantastic in ways that illuminated truth. That's Gogol's real legacy. Not the religious tracts, not the moral instructions, the stories that showed human beings in all their complicated absurdity. And the man who created them couldn't see their value because he'd convinced himself that only explicit moral instruction mattered, that art without a clear message was worthless, that laughter was somehow less holy than tears. He died believing he'd failed, but he'd succeeded beyond measure. He'd changed how Russian writers thought about their craft. He'd influenced everyone who came after him. He'd created works that would outlive empires, just not in the way he'd wanted. The question we're left with is why this happened. Why does brilliant satirical work require the writer to see humanity clearly, including its flaws, while moral instruction seems to demand blindness to complexity? Look at the Inspector General. The play works because Gogol understood that corruption isn't simple evil. The officials aren't monsters. They're ordinary people who've learned that survival means going along, that honesty is punished, that the system rewards those who play the game. They're terrified of the fake inspector not because they're villains, but because they're trapped in a world where everyone is guilty of something and power is arbitrary. That's insight. That's truth. That's what makes the play devastating. Now imagine Gogol trying to write a sequel where those same officials see the error of their ways and become honest. Where does that truth go? It evaporates. Because real people don't transform through abstract moral revelation. They change when circumstances force them to, when self-interest aligns differently, when they're given genuine alternatives to the systems that shape them. Gogol couldn't write that. His religious framework demanded that people change through divine grace and moral instruction, but his artistic instincts told him that's not how humans actually work. The conflict was unbearable. The same pattern shows up in The Overcoat. Arkady Akakievich isn't virtuous in any conventional sense. He's limited, obsessed with trivialities, incapable of understanding the larger world. But Gogol makes you care about him because he shows you the human being beneath the ridiculous exterior. The coat matters because dignity matters, because everyone deserves to feel like they belong, because the cruelty of indifference is real, even when directed at people who seem insignificant. That's moral art. It doesn't preach, it makes you see. Try to write a version where Akaki learns important lessons and becomes a better person. The story dies because the power comes from showing that his worth isn't conditional on improvement. He deserves basic human consideration exactly as he is. Gogol's religious mentors couldn't accept this. They wanted literature that explicitly taught virtue, that showed good people rewarded and bad people punished, that made moral categories clear and absolute. They wanted propaganda for salvation, and Gogol tried to give them what they wanted. That's what selected passages from Correspondence with Friends was supposed to be. Explicit moral instruction, clear guidelines for Russian improvement, direct advocacy for the social order as divinely ordained. The book is unreadable now, not because the politics are reactionary, though they are, but because it's dead on the page. There's no life in it, no observation, no recognition of how humans actually think and feel and justify themselves. It's a manual written by someone who's forgotten what people are really like. The reaction was savage. Belinsky, who championed Gogol's earlier work, wrote a furious letter that's become more famous than the book it attacked. He accused Gogol of betraying everything his satires had stood for, of selling out to the forces he'd once exposed, of using his literary authority to defend oppression. Belinsky was right about the politics, but he missed something crucial. This wasn't cynical betrayal. This was Gogol genuinely trying to become the moral teacher he thought God wanted him to be. He believed every word. He thought this was his true calling and that his satirical works had been a distraction from his real purpose. The failure broke him. If he couldn't succeed as a moral instructor, if even his explicit attempts to teach virtue fell flat, what did that say about his spiritual state? What did it mean about his relationship with God? This drove him back to Dead Souls Part 2 with renewed desperation. He had to make it work. He had to prove that art could redeem, that literature could save souls, that he personally could fulfill the mission he believed God had assigned him. But every draft revealed the same problem. His virtuous characters were wooden. His reformed sinners were unconvincing. The energy that made Part 1 crackle was completely absent. He was trying to write against his own talent, forcing his gift into a mould it couldn't fit. The fragments that survive show a writer at war with himself. There are moments where the old Gogol breaks through, where a character comes alive through some perfectly observed detail or absurd situation. Then the moral framework reasserts itself and everything goes flat again. Reading these fragments is like watching someone slowly suffocate. You can see what he's trying to do. You can understand why he thinks it matters. But you can also see that it's not working, that the attempt is killing the very thing that made his work powerful. His friends saw it too. They urged him to give up the religious obsession and return to what he did best. Write another play. Write more Ukrainian stories. Stop trying to save Russia and just observe it clearly. But Gogol couldn't hear them. He'd convinced himself that his earlier success was spiritually worthless, that laughter was less important than tears, that making people think was inferior to making them believe. Father Konstantinovsky reinforced this at every turn. The priest saw literature itself as suspect, a worldly vanity that distracted from true devotion. He demanded that Gogol renounce his literary career entirely, that he see his previous works as sins requiring repentance, and Gogol, already fragile and guilt-ridden, increasingly accepted this judgment. His health deteriorated. He stopped eating properly. He subjected himself to extreme fasts and religious exercises that his body couldn't handle. His friends watched helplessly as he destroyed himself through misguided piety. The second burning of Dead Souls. Part 2 happened in this context. Gogol was physically weak, mentally unstable, spiritually tormented. Konstantinovsky had convinced him that the manuscript was an obstacle to his salvation, that finishing it would damn his soul, so he burned it. Again, years of work, the project he dedicated his life to, reduced to ash, and then he starved himself to death. Refused food, refused medical care, accepted barbaric treatments from doctors who had no idea what they were doing. Leeches on his face, ice water over his head, hot baths that burned his skin. He died believing he'd failed God, failed Russia, failed himself. His last coherent words were reportedly prayers asking for forgiveness. He thought he was going to hell. The tragedy is that his literary legacy did exactly what he'd hoped his religious writing would do. It made Russians examine their society. It forced them to confront corruption and cruelty they'd normalized. It expanded the boundaries of what literature could accomplish. Dostoevsky didn't claim that all Russian realists came from under Gogol's moral treatises. He said they came from under the Overcoat. The work Gogol feared was sinful became the foundation for an entire tradition of socially conscious literature. Tolstoy, Chekhov, Turgenev, all of them learned from Gogol, not from his attempts at moral instruction, but from his satirical observations. They learned that you could take ordinary people seriously, that you could find profound meaning in small lives, that comedy and tragedy weren't opposites, but different angles on the same human experience. The Inspector General is still performed. The Overcoat is still read. Dead Souls. Part 1 is still considered a masterpiece. These works haven't aged. They're not museum pieces. They're living literature that continues to illuminate how societies work and how individuals get crushed by systems they can't control. Everything Gogol tried to accomplish through preaching, he accomplished through showing. Everything he thought was a distraction from his true purpose turned out to be his true purpose. Everything he feared was sinful was actually sacred, in the sense that it treated human beings with the dignity and complexity they deserve. The works that survive aren't the fragments of Part 2. They're the satirical pieces he thought were spiritually worthless. They're the stories that made people uncomfortable, that refused to offer easy answers, that showed life as messy and complicated and resistant to simple moral categories. And that's the final irony. Gogol died thinking he'd wasted his life on frivolity when he should have been saving souls. But his satirical works did more for human dignity than any sermon could have. They made readers see people they dismissed. They made corruption visible. They made cruelty intolerable. That's what art can do when it's honest. It can change how people see the world without telling them what to think. It can create empathy without demanding it. It can reveal truth without claiming to possess it. Gogol couldn't accept this because he wanted certainty. He wanted clear moral categories. He wanted to know that his work was unambiguously good, that God approved, that he was fulfilling a divine mission. But art doesn't work that way. It works through ambiguity, through observation, through showing rather than telling. It works by trusting readers to draw their own conclusions, to engage with complexity, to recognize themselves in characters they'd rather not identify with. The moment you try to control the message, the moment you decide exactly what readers should think, you kill the thing that makes literature powerful. You turn living characters into moral examples. You turn complex situations into lessons. You turn art into propaganda. Gogol learned this the hard way. His attempts at explicit moral instruction fell flat. His masterpieces, the ones that refused to preach, changed Russian literature forever. The tragedy is that he never understood what he'd accomplished. He died convinced he'd failed when he'd actually succeeded beyond measure. The question becomes, what do we do with this? How do we make sense of a life that ended in such spectacular self-destruction while producing works that endure precisely because they refuse the tidy resolutions their creator craved? Start with what's verifiable. Gogol burned Part 2 of Dead Souls on the night of February 24th, 1852. Friends heard about it the next morning. They arrived to find him in bed, refusing food, refusing medical help, insisting he'd acted correctly. Within days he was dying. Within 9 days he was dead. The doctors tried everything: leeches, ice water baths, hot water immersions. They tied him down to prevent him from removing the leeches. They forced treatments on a man too weak to resist. Whether these interventions hastened his death or simply tormented his final days is impossible to determine. What's certain is that Gogol's body gave out while his mind cycled between lucidity and delirium. During the coherent moments, he apparently expressed no regret about burning the manuscript. He'd done what Father Konstantinovsky demanded. He'd destroyed the sinful work. Now he was ready to die. This is where most accounts end. Gogol, the tortured genius, destroyed by religious mania and creative paralysis, dying in agony after burning his masterpiece. It's dramatic. It's tragic. It confirms everything we want to believe about the relationship between art and suffering. But consider the alternative reading. What if burning Part 2 wasn't madness but clarity? What if Gogol understood something about his work that took literary critics another century to articulate? He'd spent a decade trying to write virtuous characters. Every attempt failed. The pages that survive from Part 2 show exactly why. The reformed Chichikov is wooden. The noble landowner is unconvincing. The moral examples read like cardboard cutouts compared to the vibrant scoundrels of Part 1. Gogol knew this. His letters admit it. He couldn't create good characters because goodness, when rendered explicitly, becomes boring. Virtue described directly loses its power. The moment you try to demonstrate moral superiority through fiction, you kill the fiction. So maybe the burning wasn't capitulation to Father Konstantinovsky's fanaticism. Maybe it was recognition that the project was impossible, that the divine comedy structure he'd envisioned couldn't work in prose, that his attempt to redeem Russia through positive examples was fundamentally misconceived. If that's the case, then the burning was a creative decision, not a religious breakdown. A painful acknowledgement that he'd spent 10 years pursuing the wrong goal, that his real gift lay elsewhere, that trying to be a moral teacher had destroyed his ability to be an artist. This doesn't make the act less tragic, it makes it more so, because it means Gogol understood what he was doing. He wasn't mad, he was making a choice, destroying what didn't work rather than releasing something he knew was inferior to his earlier achievements. The problem is we can't know. The manuscript is gone. The 4 surviving chapters aren't enough to judge the whole. We're left with speculation about a work that exists only as absence. What we do have is the earlier work, the Inspector General, the Overcoat, Dead Souls, Part 1, Diary of a Madman, The Nose. These survived because Gogol never seriously considered destroying them. They existed in the world. They'd been published. They'd influenced other writers. You can't unwrite what's already been read. And here's what those works demonstrate. Gogol's genius wasn't for moral instruction. It was for showing people in all their complexity without telling you what to think about them. His characters are simultaneously sympathetic and ridiculous, tragic and absurd, worthy of pity and contempt. Take the mayor in the Inspector General. He's corrupt, incompetent, cowardly. He exploits his position shamelessly. But he's also desperate, anxious, trying to maintain order in a system that's fundamentally broken. The play doesn't excuse his behaviour. It doesn't condemn him either. It shows him as he is and lets you draw conclusions. Or Akaki Akakievich in The Overcoat. He's pathetic. His obsession with the coat is out of proportion. His inability to assert himself is frustrating. But he's also trying to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. His suffering is real, even if his goals seem trivial. This refusal to simplify, to reduce characters to moral examples, is what made Gogol's work revolutionary. Russian literature before him tended toward types: the noble peasant, the corrupt official, the virtuous maiden. Characters existed to illustrate moral points. Gogol created individuals, people who contradicted themselves, who wanted contradictory things, who couldn't be reduced to single qualities. His officials aren't just corrupt, they're also fearful, ambitious, petty, occasionally kind, capable of genuine affection for their families while exploiting everyone else. This complexity is why the works endure. They resist simple interpretations. Every generation finds something new in them because they're not delivering predetermined messages. They're presenting situations that remain morally ambiguous no matter how many times you analyze them. Should we pity Akaki Akakievich or be frustrated by his passivity? Both. Is the mayor in The Inspector General a villain or a victim? Both. Is Chichikov in Dead Souls a clever entrepreneur or a parasitic fraud? Both. The questions don't have final answers because the characters are constructed to resist finality. They're like real people in that way. You can understand them better with a repeated observation, but you never completely figure them out. Gogol couldn't accept this. He wanted his work to have clear moral purpose. He wanted readers to become better people through reading him. He wanted literature to be a tool for spiritual improvement. But his actual achievement was different. His work made readers see the world differently. Not because it told them what to think, but because it showed them things they hadn't noticed. The small humiliations of bureaucratic life, the way power corrupts through tiny daily compromises, the desperation of people trying to maintain status in a system designed to keep them down. These observations changed Russian literature permanently. After Gogol, you couldn't write about officials without acknowledging their humanity. You couldn't portray poverty without recognizing its psychological effects. You couldn't treat social climbing as simple villainy. The tradition of socially conscious Russian literature, the tradition that produced Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov, comes directly from Gogol. Not from his moral treatises, but from his satirical observations, from his ability to show how systems crush individuals, from his refusal to make suffering noble or poverty picturesque. That's the legacy. Not the burned manuscripts, or the religious crisis, or the bizarre death. The works that survived and changed what literature could do. Gogol died thinking he'd failed. He wanted to save Russia's soul. He wanted to create moral examples that would inspire virtue. He wanted to be a teacher rather than an entertainer. Instead, he created works that revealed how society actually functioned. That showed the gap between official ideology and lived experience. That demonstrated how ordinary people suffered under systems they couldn't control. That's more valuable than any sermon. That's what survives when the preaching is forgotten. The final irony is perfect. Everything Gogol tried to accomplish through explicit moral instruction, he accomplished through satirical observation. Everything he thought was his real work turned out to be preliminary. Everything he feared was sinful became the foundation for a literary tradition. He couldn't see it because he was too close, too consumed by religious anxiety, too convinced that literature needed to serve a higher purpose than showing life as it actually was. But showing life as it actually was turned out to be the higher purpose, making readers see what they'd been taught not to notice, creating empathy for people they'd been trained to dismiss, revealing the mechanisms of social control and individual suffering. That's what art can do when it's honest, not when it's trying to teach lessons or inspire virtue, but when it's simply observing carefully and reporting truthfully. Gogol's tragedy wasn't that he failed, it was that he succeeded in ways he couldn't recognize as success. His works did exactly what great literature should do. They changed how people saw the world. They made the invisible visible. They created space for new kinds of stories, about new kinds of people. And they did all of this not by preaching, but by showing. Not by telling readers what to think, but by presenting situations complex enough to sustain multiple interpretations, not by simplifying, but by revealing complexity. That's the lesson. Not the one Gogol thought he was teaching, but the one his work actually teaches. Truth isn't simple. People aren't simple. Society isn't simple. And literature that pretends otherwise isn't literature at all. It's propaganda, or it's wishful thinking, or it's moral instruction masquerading as art. Real art trusts readers to handle complexity. It presents life without reducing it to lessons. It shows people in all their contradictions without demanding that you judge them in predetermined ways. Gogol created that kind of art, then spent the last decade of his life trying to create something else, something simpler, something with clear moral purpose. It didn't work because it couldn't work, because his genius was for complexity, not simplicity, for observation, not instruction, for showing, not telling. The works that survive prove it. They're still read not because they teach clear lessons, but because they refuse to. They're still relevant not because they simplify, but because they complicate. They're still powerful, not because they resolve, but because they reveal. That's what makes them literature rather than propaganda. That's what makes them art rather than preaching. That's what makes them survive when so much else from the same era has been forgotten. Gogol couldn't accept what he'd accomplished. He died convinced he'd wasted his life. on frivolity, but the frivolity turned out to be the substance. The diversions turned out to be the destination. The works he thought distracted from his true purpose turned out to be his true purpose. The man who died tied to a bed in 1852 left behind a puzzle that Russia is still trying to solve. Not the puzzle of who he was exactly, but the puzzle of why someone so brilliant at showing truth couldn't recognize it in his own work. Here's what we know for certain. Gogol wrote to the Inspector General, Dead Souls Part 1, The Overcoat, and a handful of other works that permanently altered Russian literature. Then he spent a decade trying to write something else, something he considered more important, and failed. Then he burned what he'd written and starved himself to death. The standard interpretation treats this as tragedy, genius destroyed by religious mania, artist crushed by impossible expectations, writer paralyzed by the gap between ambition and ability. All of that's true, but it misses something crucial. Gogol's final years weren't just about failure. They were about the collision between two incompatible ideas about what literature should do. One idea said literature should observe reality carefully and present it honestly, trusting readers to draw their own conclusions. The other said literature should guide readers toward moral improvement through explicit instruction. Gogol believed the second idea. His actual work demonstrated the first. This isn't a contradiction. He could have resolved through better thinking or clearer writing. It's fundamental. The qualities that make satirical observation powerful, the refusal to simplify, the commitment to showing rather than telling, the trust in readers to handle complexity, these same qualities make moral instruction impossible. You can write satire or you can write sermons. You can observe or you can instruct. You can show life as it is or show life as it should be, but you can't do both simultaneously. The attempt produces exactly what Gogol produced in Dead Souls Part 2. Wooden characters, lifeless prose, good intentions strangling artistic truth. The burning makes sense in this context, not as madness, but as recognition. Gogol had spent 10 years proving that his religious project was impossible. The manuscript represented a decade of failure. Keeping it meant preserving evidence of his inability to become what he thought God wanted him to be. So he destroyed it, and having destroyed it, having eliminated the project that had consumed him, having admitted through action what he couldn't admit through words, he had nothing left. The work he thought mattered was ash. The work that actually mattered, he'd come to see as sinful. What does someone do in that position? Where do you go when you've convinced yourself that your greatest achievements are your greatest failures? Gogol's answer was to stop eating, to refuse medical care, to accept barbaric treatments without resistance, to die. It took 9 days. 9 days of leeches and ice water and hot baths. 9 days of friends begging him to eat. 9 days of doctors making everything worse while thinking they were helping. 9 days of physical agony compounding spiritual despair. And at the end of those 9 days, Russia's greatest satirist was dead at 42, convinced he'd failed God and wasted his talent. The funeral drew thousands. The eulogies praised his genius. Critics who'd savaged selected passages now claimed him as a progressive hero. Conservatives who'd appreciated his final religious turn now celebrated him as a defender of traditional values. Everyone wanted to explain what Gogol had really meant, what he'd really believed, what his work really represented. But Gogol was beyond explaining. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to understand what he was supposed to be, and he died without answers. What he left behind was the work. Not the work he wanted to leave, but the work he actually created. The satires he feared were sinful. The observations he thought were distractions from his true purpose. The comedies that made people laugh when he wanted them to weep. And here's what happened to that work. It survived, it influenced, it changed things. Dostoevsky built his entire approach on Gogol's foundation. the psychological depth, the sympathy for the downtrodden, the understanding that small humiliations reveal larger truths. All of that comes from the Overcoat. Tolstoy learned from Gogol how to show social systems crushing individuals, how to present injustice without melodrama, how to make readers see what they'd been trained not to notice. Chekhov took Gogol's ability to blend comedy and tragedy, to find the absurd in the everyday and the profound in the trivial, and built an entirely new kind of drama from it. Every Russian writer who came after had to reckon with Gogol, not with his religious treatises or his moral instructions, but with his satirical observations, with his refusal to simplify, with his commitment to showing people as they actually were, rather than as they should be. That's the legacy, not what he intended, but what he accomplished despite his intentions. The works he thought would save Russia, the explicit moral instructions, the religious meditations, the attempts at portraying virtue, all of that's forgotten. Scholars study selected passages from correspondence with friends to understand Gogol's psychology, not because the book itself has literary value. The Fragments of Dead Souls. Part 2 get read as curiosities, evidence of what might have been, but nobody mistakes them for achievements. What survives is what Gogol feared was worthless: the satires, the comedies, the observations that refused to preach, the characters who contradicted themselves and couldn't be reduced to moral categories, the situations that remained ambiguous no matter how many times you analysed them. These works did more for human dignity than any sermon could have. They made readers see people they'd dismissed. They revealed the mechanisms of social control. They showed how systems crush individuals while pretending to serve them. They created empathy without demanding it. They changed how people saw the world without telling them what to think. That's what art can do when it's honest, when it trusts observation over instruction, when it shows rather than tells, when it presents complexity rather than simplifying it into lessons. Gogol never understood this. He died convinced that his satirical works were spiritual failures, that laughter was less valuable than tears, that making people think was inferior to making them believe. But the work itself proves him wrong. The Inspector General is still performed because it reveals something true about power and corruption that remains relevant across centuries and cultures. The Overcoat is still read because it captures something essential about human dignity and social indifference that every generation recognizes. Dead Souls. Part 1 endures because its observations about spiritual emptiness and social pretension haven't aged at all. These works weren't distractions from Gogol's true purpose. They were his true purpose, whether he recognized it or not. The tragedy isn't that he failed to complete his religious project. The tragedy is that he never recognized the value of what he'd already accomplished. He spent his final decade trying to become someone he wasn't, trying to write works his talent couldn't produce, trying to serve a god who'd already given him exactly the gifts he needed. The satirical vision that made him great, the ability to observe without judging, to show without telling, to trust readers, to handle complexity. This wasn't a lesser calling, it was the calling. The work he feared was sinful was actually sacred, in the sense that it treated human beings with the dignity and honesty they deserve. Everything he tried to accomplish through preaching, he accomplished through observation. Everything he thought was frivolous turned out to be fundamental. Everything he burned or wanted to burn survived anyway, carried forward by readers and writers who recognized its value even when its creator couldn't. The man died in 1852. The work lives on. And the distance between those two facts, between Gogol's self-assessment and literature's verdict, tells you everything you need to know about the difference between intention and achievement, between what artists think they're doing and what they actually accomplish. Gogol wanted to save Russia's soul. Instead, he gave Russia the tools to see itself clearly. That's not a failure. That's a different kind of success, more valuable and more lasting than the one he imagined. The burning of dead souls. Part 2 destroyed a manuscript. It didn't destroy the legacy. The death in 1852 ended a life. It didn't end the influence. The man who thought he'd failed had actually succeeded beyond any measure he would have recognized. And that's the final lesson, the one Gogol himself never learned. Sometimes the work knows better than the artist. Sometimes achievement looks different from what you planned. Sometimes the greatest success is the one you can't see because you're too busy measuring yourself against an impossible standard you invented. Gogol set out to be a prophet. He became an observer. He wanted to teach virtue. He revealed vice. He tried to inspire moral transformation. He created psychological insight. None of that was what he intended. All of that was what literature needed, what Russia needed, what readers across 2 centuries have needed. The work survived because it was true. Not true to Gogol's intentions, but true to human experience. True to how societies actually function. True to how power actually operates. True to how individuals actually suffer under systems they can't control. That kind of truth doesn't age. It doesn't become obsolete. It doesn't stop being relevant when political systems change or religious frameworks shift. It endures because it's observational rather than ideological, descriptive rather than prescriptive, honest rather than wishful. Gogol died believing he'd wasted his talent on trivialities, but the trivialities were the substance, the observations were the achievement. The works he feared were failures changed literature permanently. 200 years later, we're still reading The Overcoat, still performing The Inspector General, still teaching Dead Souls Part 1, still learning from a writer who never understood what he'd accomplished. That's the real story. Not the burning or the death or the religious crisis. The story is that a brilliant observer convinced himself that observation wasn't enough, spent a decade trying to be something else, failed, and destroyed the evidence of his failure. While the evidence of his success, the satirical works he'd created before the crisis, continued doing exactly what great literature does, making people see, making them think, making them recognize truth even when it's uncomfortable. Gogol couldn't accept what he'd given the world because it didn't match what he thought the world needed. But the world knew better. It kept the satires, it learned from the observations, it built an entire literary tradition on the foundation Gogol had laid. The man who died tied to a bed in 1852 left behind works that are still alive in 2024. That's not the immortality he wanted, but it's the immortality that matters. Not because his name is remembered, but because his insights remain true, his observations remain relevant, his characters remain recognizable across centuries of social change. That's what survives when the preaching is forgotten. That's what endures when the moral instructions fade. That's what literature does when it's honest enough to show rather than tell, brave enough to observe rather than instruct, wise enough to trust readers with complexity rather than reducing everything to simple lessons. Gogol gave us that, not intentionally, not willingly, but completely. And for that, despite everything, despite the tragedy and the waste and the unnecessary suffering, we should be grateful.